Hey, Vernon, Pastor Vernon Gordon with me. Man, thank you so much for joining me in a conversation today, Pastor. I really appreciate your time, and I'm looking forward to getting to know you a lot today. And I know it's kind of cool because as I'm getting to know you, I just got your permission, and you were so open and just made yourself available to say, sure, the whole world can watch us get to know each other. And so it's kind of awkward, but we're in some strange times right now. And I want to talk a lot with you today about racial tension and about relationships and about ministry and about reconciliation and get your thoughts on a lot of these subjects today as I get to know you, as the rest of those who are just kind of watching in. So listen, if you're just tuning in and watching this on YouTube or online right now, I just want to thank you for peering in on our conversation and welcome you to share this with others if you'd like to, if you think it's helpful. So Pastor, tell us a little bit and tell me a little bit about you. Give me a snapshot, like give me the condensed story of your life, a little bit about you, your background. Let us get to know you a little bit.
Absolutely, man. Well, first of all, Pastor Shane, thank you for just the conversation and the few moments we've already been able to talk on the phone, and then to have this time. I just know you to be someone with a great heart, and I'm excited to just continue this dialogue, not just for us, but for so many, as I believe is so needed for our time. So I'm excited to do that. A little bit about me. Wow. Tell a black pastor to go fast. Let me see what I'm gonna do here. No, it's I grew up in Hampton Roads, Virginia, and I am the product of Chesapeake, Virginia, specifically. I'm married to Ashley Gordon. My wife and I met when we were 16 years old. So
Wow.
we've been together for quite some time, but married 8 years. But we have two beautiful children, Madison and Jackson. Madison, who's 6, who one of the videos that you were talking about, she was referenced in when she was starting kindergarten. And then I have a 4-year-old who's in preschool, Jackson. So we have a girl and a boy and a church that we planted, which we consider our third baby. So we have the blessing and the privilege of church planting in July of 2015, and we're the lead pastors of the Life Church here on the south side of Richmond, Virginia. And it's just been a joy. We're having a blast what it means to be a part of this community, the city, and to have a young family and to feel the pace of all of that. And so it's been fun times. And so that's a little bit about who we are.
That's awesome, man. So when was the third baby birth at Life Church? When did y'all start?
July of 2015. We started out at Benford Middle School, right downtown in Richmond, Virginia, off of Floyd Avenue. And for my wife and I, Richmond became home through college. We both, again, grew up in Hampton Roads. We both went to VCU. She was way smarter than me, so I definitely probably followed her, but don't tell her that. But we had the opportunity to go to VCU. She got a job at Ernst & Young Accounting right out of college. And at that time, I was not in full-time ministry yet. And so she had a stable job, and I had dreams and aspirations. And so we were in Richmond, and then I shortly thereafter started seminary at Virginia Union University, and then became a youth pastor in Moseley, Virginia, at Spring Creek Baptist Church. And so, but the church really formed after about 5 years of youth ministry. Our pastors blessed us to be able to plant this church, like I said, downtown in Richmond. And it's been a beautiful 5-year journey. We went from Benford Middle School to an older church congregation who graciously opened up their doors for us a year after our inception. And then a couple years ago, we closed on our first permanent property around 3 years old on Bryce Lane in the south side of Richmond, Virginia. So we're super excited about what God has done. And before all of the pandemic, we were at about 3 services and a little over 1,000 people. And we just, it's been a roller coaster for 2 of us who grew up in small country churches in Chesapeake, Virginia. So we often tell people the largest church we're a part of is the one we're leading. So we're building the plane as we fly, but we're having a blast doing it.
Man, Pastor, that is so cool, dude. That is amazing. I love hearing that story. You and I met I think about a year ago at a
Yeah.
conference, and or maybe not quite a year ago now, but met at a conference briefly through a mutual friend, and uh, and then I saw your stories online, and we actually weren't Facebook friends at the time. You accepted my friendship. I appreciate that. And thank you.
Absolutely.
I don't know if I'd have called you if you didn't know. Actually, no, it's not true. Actually, I messaged you
Yep.
as soon as I saw your videos.
Mm.
Your very first video, you posted 3 of them that I watched. This of your story, specific of your story. And after the first video, I knew I wanted to be in relationship with you, and I hoped, and it was kind of weird. I know it was weird. I,
No.
y'all listening in, this is weird. This is stalkerish, but I just messaged him and sent him my cell phone number and said, which is so bizarre, but I just said, hey, can we talk and get to know each other? And I've already been so blessed through our conversation, getting to know you a little bit. Thank you for letting everybody in, and just, you know, you in your videos, you just opened up your life to us and to the world watching. And I loved your stories you shared. You shared these vulnerable stories. The first one was about you and the just taking a time out in a moment in front of your house, in your car,
Yep.
in front of your own house, and when a police officer was called by one of your neighbors, and as a suspicious character sitting in the neighborhood, and you tell these stories of these really hard to hear stories of how you've experienced discrimination, how you've experienced racism, how you've experienced your experience in our culture as an African American man. But then you went to the second one, dude, and it wasn't just an African American male in our culture. It was, now let me tell you about what it is for my African American family.
Mm.
And then you opened up stories about your own daughter being attacked multiple times at her brand new school after moving into a new neighborhood. And then finally, your experience in the third story with the racial tension you've experienced in the church. And dude, I hadn't even watched all of those things, but I just wanted to be in conversation with you and get to know your heart. But let me ask you, what made you feel it was important to share your personal and really painful stories so publicly?
Well, Pastor Shane, I think I've shared a little bit about this in the first video, but um, I woke up that morning after the killing of Ahmaud Arbery, and I had posted a picture, but it just didn't feel like that was enough. Felt like that in the many relationships I had, both black and white alike, we tend to, I think, really kind of put things at an arm's length, right? That's the thing happening over there, or that's the thing that happened in Florida or Georgia or South Carolina or so many other places. And I just felt, and I told my wife when I woke up that morning, I said, hey, I just really want to share a little bit of our stories. Are you comfortable? And I want to be in one accord with her. And I felt like a big reason the why was so that people could understand that these are the experience and the stories of people right around you each and every day. That these are not just far off experiences or one-off experiences, which is sometimes what I think people think. Like these are these exclusive experiences isolated to a particular incident, but they're not the norm. They're exception to the rule. And I thought just by sharing a little of our story, particularly because I think when you are a pastor and you work in ministry, people sometimes even feel like you're exempt. I'm sure as a pastor, you can articulate this, exempt from anything for that matter, right? So like you don't have any challenges and your marriage is always perfect and life is always ideal.
Yeah.
But I thought it was equally as important because of that reason to be able to say, it still takes a measure of faith and energy and intentionality for us to navigate peace and hope and and building bridges. And so I just thought it was important to put a face to the experience that was a little bit closer to people. And quite frankly, I thought it would have the level of reach that it had. I thought it might just speak to some of the relationships we had already had that were pre-existing. But God has really opened up a bigger conversation that I'm really grateful to be having.
Thank you. And thank you to you and your wife for just being willing to be this vulnerable. We've all been impacted in this conversation of racial tension. But for you to personally say, hey, listen, for you and I, in just our relationship, that we don't really know each other that well. We're just getting to know each other. And hey, I just lived right across the river from you, man. And this is what my experience is, in such a vulnerable way. But you mentioned in one of your videos, man, of the kind of, you kind of referenced a little bit of risk in sharing this, and that you mentioned you've never shared these stories before. Now, for your family, I can definitely, everyone be like, wow, I mean, that, because protect your daughter, those kinds of relationships. But you mentioned, hey, this was video one. Hey, I haven't shared these stories. I haven't shared this my experience. And you reference it as if it was going to be a little bit of risk or potentially cost. Can you help people understand, or help me understand, why it's easier just to not tell stories of racial discrimination, or what do you risk by telling or not telling them?
Yeah, I think, on one hand, Pastor Shane, I think it's important for everybody watching to understand that for Black people to talk to Black people about it, it's kind of like, well, yeah, yep, happened to me. Yep, a couple of years ago, right? So it's actually some of the stories that I shared, and of course our daughter's story, Black, white, or indifferent, that kind of wrenches, in a different way. But definitely the experience of my experience with the police officer in my neighborhood, aggressively forcing me to prove. I mean, there were even details of that story, Pastor Shane, where I didn't share just in the interest of time on the video, but he was like, well, do you have a utility bill on you? And I was like, who walks around with a utility bill on them?
Yeah.
Like that's
Does
not
anybody else
common.
drive with utility bills? Yeah.
Yeah, common practice. So again, as I mentioned in that video, it wasn't until I actually had to walk up to my door, escort him, and put my key in the door and prove that I lived there. I think for many of my Black friends, that's kind of like commonplace. I mean, it's not that everybody's had the same experience to that extreme, but the idea of being followed, the idea of having to prove their legitimacy in a specific space or setting has been common practice. I probably say the biggest risk of sharing it with the more open audiences, as you talked about, is one, I had to wrestle with the reality that I still want my children to be able to coexist in these environments without feeling like they're, being now another target for a different reason, or well, I can't believe, you brought that up, and now you're calling things out that really, people have to address, right? And then you hope that when you send your child out of your presence, that those things don't result in further discrimination or isolation or being ostracized in some way. So, our family has to wrestle with that, right? We just moved into the neighborhood. We still want to get along with our neighbors.
Yeah.
And when you really ruffle the feathers of people, make no mistake about it, people can hurt you in ways that are other than just physically. People can not invite, and people can not create the same opportunity for you. And if you think those things don't happen, then I think there's a certain measure of the world that just hoping these conversations expose you to. I'll also say, you also have to wrestle with the idea that, as much, in my experience, as much as people love to talk about topics, we tend to like to talk about them when they make us feel comfortable and convenient. So I reference this, if, the risk that I might take, or our family might take, is in a world where we want to be a part of the ministry of reconciliation, people, as a generalization, are comfortable with reconciliation as long as it doesn't wrestle with their idea of how the world should work. And
Yeah.
when it starts to pull the covers off of, privilege and racism and preferential treatment and injustice, I think what tends to happen is well, we would have him come and preach, or we would have him come and share, but what if he says this, you know,
Sure.
and for us, that's just what if he shares truth, but truth is not always comfortable. And so, I want to continue to be a valuable part of a bridge building conversation. But I think sometimes what it can seem like is you can only be a part of that conversation if you continue to perpetuate a theme of comfort, and not a theme of, kind of wrestling with the tough realities of injustice that we experience all around us. So those are risks. I mean, but I thought it was necessary. Pastor Shane, I really feel like this moment is different from some of the previous situations because everybody saw it.
Mm. Talk about that for a moment. What was the impact of this tragic death of Ahmaud Arbery, and not just the impact of the tragedy, but the impact of this moment? And what was that impact? And you mentioned it's different. Why do you think it's so different?
If just to be candid, I think it's different because in many other cases prior to this one, there was always a measure of ambiguity, right? So, I mean, and I would say the first case that impacted me generationally was Trayvon Martin,
Mm.
a young man, for those who don't know, who was in Florida traveling home, self-policing or hypervigilance in community policing took place once again, very similar to the circumstances surrounding the Ahmaud Arbery case. But there was no video, there was no surveillance. It was only the word of one person who was alive and one young man who was dead. And in that case, worked into the favor of George Zimmerman. And you kind of see these cases, that emerge, Mike Brown, but then there are these the media representation of his character and integrity. And so then you have all of these cases. You have these instances where brutality has taken place, or hypervigilance or over policing, but there's always a measure of ambiguity. Well, what was he doing, and what happened?
Yeah, what was he
And then
doing
you
in
have
that
this situation.
neighborhood, or what did he do to break the law, or what? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So then you get this situation, right? And I can run down the list. Sandra Bland, right? She shot and killed on a traffic stop, but we just don't know what happened. Well, this case, we do know what happened, right? Like, he was just running around his neighborhood, not a neighborhood, his neighborhood, and was shot and killed because he fit the description. And I fit a description, and so many others fit a description. And so I think that what makes this case unique is when you can't ignore what's in front of you, what is so clear, it became public outrage and not just Black outrage. And I think that's what made this significantly different. For the last 2 months, his parents had something to say about this case. It didn't matter if there was Black outrage.
Right.
It had to turn into public outrage.
Yeah.
And then something
When did you
was
learn?
done.
When did you learn of this? Because it's been 2.5 months. I only learned of it a week ago, or less than a week ago, last Wednesday. When did you learn of this?
Same, same.
So
Heard about it
that's
on Wednesday. It became good.
I was just going to say that's telling, right? Because the rest of the world, none of us knew. And this poor mother's praying for 2.5 months. She said she's praying for justice. And
Yeah,
I I think about that, and I think about that impact. You said it's universal, right? This is different.
this one is
And
different.
this is an opportunity for you and I, and people who are different than us, who have different cultures than us, who look differently than us,
Yeah.
um, to have conversation because we're unified and we're not debating the details of the case, so to speak, like you said. Um, but tell me, help me learn, and help all of us learn how this tragedy not just impacted in opening the door for conversation, but how did it impact you personally? How does it impact your family personally?
Well, Pastor, I think that's a great question. If I could, right before I get there, I think I would love to start at a macro level of why I think it impacts all of us a little bit, and then talk about how it impacted us personally. one of the things I think I'd be remiss if I didn't say this. It's very important for anybody watching to know that when you hear people of color, Black and brown people, expressing discontent with things like the justice system and so forth and so on, it's not because every case ends up in death. I think what happens is it's like, well, you can't tell me everybody's being shot all the time. Maybe not. But if you're being questioned all the time, or if there is an added pressure, my wife and I had a conversation after the Ahmaud Arbery shooting, and a lot of people did the 2.23 or 2.24 run. And it was this thought to wave to my neighbors so they know I belong here. Not because I want to just be a neighbor, but because I want them to recognize me, right, as just a part of the community. And I want everybody to wrestle with that sense of, no, not every situation, not every injustice or discrimination or bias ends in death. And while those are the most tragic of circumstances, many of them just end in perpetuated discomfort, right? The young person, when we talk to teenagers who are persons of color who go to majority white schools, and it's not, again, we teach them that every white person is not evil, and just like every Black person is not a criminal, and nobody wants to live by the way of stereotypes. But I really want people to wrestle with this reality of, it's about the extra question, the extra look, the extra feeling of, I just can't wear my most comfortable clothes out the house, even down to cultural representation. If I walk out of my house and I am absolutely culturally comfortable wearing a hoodie and some baggier shorts, not running shorts, right? Because I didn't grow up in a running culture, right? I grew up in a basketball or an urban culture. Well, what do I look like I belong here? And I think it's those realities that I just want people to wrestle with, is the extra measure of sometimes needing to feel like there needs to be a proof that you belong and appears comfort. And you asked me specifically, how did specifically his death impact our family? And I think I alluded to it already, but I think one, it makes us more aware to make ourselves, known to our community. Now, maybe somebody else just moving in doesn't have to think about that. They'd be like, well, duh, I bought a house here, I belong here. But, my wife and I felt an extra measure of just, intentionality was needed. That if I'm walking past neighbors outside playing with their kids, I'm like, hi, how you doing? And we just moved in down the street. And subconsciously, we're doing that because we just want people to know we're here. So that if I pull in late one night, that there's no, they can say, hey, oh, that's the guy who lives 3 doors down. Not, where did he come from? And I think that's imperative. I think for our family, it's also reawakened this idea of just necessary conversations with our children. Conversations that I don't think every culture, I don't want to marginalize what it means for all of us to be parents of all backgrounds and ethnicities, the fear that we all have when we send our kids into the world. But there are different conversations when we send our kids into the world. And I'm hoping that even through the story I shared about my daughter, I think a lot of times we might even hear about the conversation, Pastor Shane, that is like, keep your hands on the tennis too when the police walk up. Don't make any sudden movements. Make sure that you don't, have an attitude. You hear those things. Many of our churches have had to offer for years, right? This isn't new. If you've grown up in a church of color, courses and classes on educating kids on what are your rights and what should you be doing and how do you get out of these situations alive. But I think what probably was most shocking to people about how it impacted our family is those conversations have to start much sooner than people think. That at 5 and 6, we have to talk to our daughter about, this idea. Like I'll be honest with you, Pastor Shane, to be very candid. When our daughter had the incident in the school, we were talking to her about, hey, it's okay, feel comfortable. We want you to focus on being comfortable at school. Miss Robinson's going to let you go sometimes, so forth and so on. But when she had the incident on the bus, I'm be honest with you, man, pastor or not, man, my advice was, hey, if somebody touches you again, punch them in the face.
Yeah,
and then
defend yourself, girl. Yeah.
Yeah. And daddy will go to school and take care of the rest. Okay. Daddy has the gift of gab. He'll figure out the rest. Okay. But it was like at some point, right? Like nobody wants their 5-year-old or my daughter just turned 6 to be harassed and then, beyond your reach, and then what then? So I would say, man, that's the impact it has. It's like, hey, there's that inner tension of, I'm not trying to create an aggressive child, but I'm also trying to create a child who understands what it means to protect herself. And so, I don't know if that answers your question or if you want me to
Oh,
go in a
that's
different
good.
direction, but candidly, those are the ways it impacts you. Is how do you do the both and as a parent, and yet still, as I
Yeah.
shared in some of my videos, Pastor Shane, I grew up in a diverse family. So how do you wrestle with the tension of protection and self-defense, and at the same time, I don't want my daughter to fear another color. No different
Yeah.
than I don't want them to fear her. I
Yeah.
don't want her to fear them.
I love this because you talk about your daughter, and you did so in your video, and all of us, no matter what your culture is, have experienced some kind of bullying or some kind of thing. I mean, I have three boys. I have a story for each of them in bullying and those kinds of things, and I want to understand differently, because what you're explaining is a culture of conversation. I have a 26-year-old son. Ahmaud Arbery would have been 26 this past Friday. He's a runner. My son's a runner. He's been running since he was in middle school when he took his first run with his dad. And I've never worried about him running in a neighborhood.
Yep.
In fact, he can run cross neighborhoods. I mean, I've worried about being hit by a car.
Yep.
My son was tragically bullied, physically bullied, attacked. Two of my three boys were physically attacked, physically bullied. But when you talked about your daughter being choked, and then you found out that it had to do with the unfortunate racial tension that we live in, and then this hate act against your daughter. Like all of us, I mean, I've had that incident on the bus, and it's my wife's helping me not drive to their house that moment as soon as he gets off the bus and tells me the story. I think about the restraint you and your wife had, and I think about, is that a part of the difference also? Because it will be viewed differently if you step into that school and say what you need to say than perhaps how I might be viewed if I step into that conversation. How you defend your daughter, how you have the conversation with the teacher, how you have the conversation with the principal, the same conversations I've had with teachers and principals. Is that a part of the difference in every aspect of this approach? Because I think what a lot of times people make a mistake of saying, oh, well, yeah, why are you complaining? I have that too,
Yeah.
Tell me why it's so different and so important I think, for people to understand the difference.
Well, I think, we got to start by addressing a real reality that, and not self-proclaimed, but culturally, there's just different values on those voices. I think more than anything, because to your point, and this is a conversation in communities of color. If we don't sometimes unify our voices, then we don't get results. But if a white parent comes up to the school, you better believe there's going to be a different level of attentiveness and awareness of their voice. And also, I think it is vitally important that we understand how much media has cultivated a perception of culture. So if I'm just being passionate about the protection of my children, and all you've seen as a representation of the Black culture has been what media has allowed through rap, through certain other streams of reality TV, or so forth and so on, you immediately process that passion as aggression, right? Whereas if another parent or person from the white culture comes in with the same passion, it can be viewed as, well, we absolutely get it, right? And I just don't think we have wrestled with enough how
Yeah, it's
much
almost like, sir,
media
calm
has.
down. We are going to handle this, versus, whoa,
Yeah,
a reaction. And you're right, it's so different. But listen, also too, isn't it so different because uh, it isn't that I was bullied and my father's and his father and their father and then horrific stories of, it wasn't just pulled over but dragged down the street, or my brother, my uncle, I don't have any of this history. I just had, my son was bullied. So when I react, I'm not reacting out of years, decades,
yeah,
lifetimes, generations
yeah,
of bullying. You're reacting to generations
yeah.
of not just
Trauma.
discrimination, but trauma.
Trauma.
Yes.
Yeah, I think people have to understand it as generational trauma. I mean, I grew up and I tell the story in the last video of both of my grandfathers. One of my grandfathers was a white man who married my black grandmother in the late 60s, early 70s, whenever the first year that interracial
And you
marriage could
said it
happen.
was, yeah, the first year where you could even legally be married. Wow.
Absolutely. And he took my grandmother in with, or not took her in, but he married her with, she already had 3 black children and they shared a life together. And one of the best examples I ever saw of a husband and a father. When my parents separated several times, I always lived with him, and he took me and my wife on our first date. And this white guy in a pickup truck listening to country music before Uber, like my grandpa was going to take us on a date, and she hops in the one bench pickup truck, and she's like, "Who's the random white guy?" And I was like, "Where's my grandpa?" So, I had that experience, and then I had my other grandfather.
That's
Watch this.
bizarre. Hey,
He lived
listen, first date with grandfather is bizarre in every culture, but that's really, yeah, that's strange.
much longer story about several cancellations, and I really like this girl so much. I said, anybody who can take me to the movies, and the last resort was white grandpa. And so, but he was
You called
amazing, man, and
everybody on the list, yeah.
everybody. But the thing about it was, even in calling everybody, I didn't call my grandpa last because he was white. I called him last because he drove the slowest, and I knew he was just gonna be like super quiet and awkward. He's a super, introvert. So anyway, that's another. I have to post a video about that one. But
Yeah,
but
dude,
then, and then
you need to do a
my other
video,
grandfather was a
hashtag grandpa date.
grandpa date. But then my other grandfather was a black man who was the first African American colonel and captain in law enforcement. Worked his way up from custodian to captain and colonel, and through much oppression and racial injustice in the 60s and 70s. I mean, you're talking about people who understood what it was to live in the race. And here's what was interesting: when my parents would separate, we would go live with my grandmother and grandfather, who were white and black. And then my girl who was black, who was in law enforcement, would say things to me like, "Hey, now don't trust white folk." And I'm like, I'm living with a white guy. Like, there was all of this reconciliation I had to do in my mind at a very early age about and I mean, I just think the big idea is, to your point, this is generations of fear and trauma and and just, perpetuated things, that we have to overcome. I mean, even the fact that when we move out this neighborhood, and yes, we wanted to give our kids a backyard. Our first home didn't have a backyard, so we didn't move into some, big mansion. We moved into a well-sized house for a family of 4 with a backyard that was fenced in, anything that any parent would want. But we also loved the numbers, the way the academic success in this area happened. But I think what people have to understand is, how do we even get to this place where she's the only young black kid at the bus stop? Well, we got here. All right. I think I went out a little bit.
Yeah, that's
Am I
okay.
back?
We could hear your voice
Yeah.
still, but you froze, but that's okay.
Yeah. But we got here in many ways because of white flight. I mean, and if you don't know what that is, I mean, you got to wrestle with those realities, right? That when you have economic wealth or some measure of economic stability, and you have the luxury of saying, okay, we want to move here together. We want to move in this context, and then we can create better schools, right? Because schools are funded by taxes. And I mean, there's so many implications to the reality, to your point of just, it's not as simple as just this idea of we all can just do the same thing and say the same thing. By virtue, being the minority means that when we make decisions, right, and many of us do this in our churches, right? Like if I'm giving someone pastoral advice, or Pastor Shane, I'm sure you would agree with this, if you're giving somebody pastoral advice, there may be this assumption sometimes that we tend to hear the few voices, but the few voices don't always represent the many, right? And so if a few people in our congregation are complaining about something, I know this never happens at your church. I'm just talking about my church. Sometimes you'll basically say like, hey, well, and any business leader does this, right? Like, all right, well, that's only a few complaints, but the vast majority of people are satisfied with our services. So we can't always make a decision for the few when we recognize that the general population that we serve is happy with what we're providing. But yet somehow we think that rule of thought doesn't apply to situations like these, right? By virtue of being the minority, if I'm in a school and my family's in a school where they are the minority, guess what? Like that principle has to reconcile. The vast majority of my parents may be absolutely satisfied with the services we're providing. So I have to weigh the frustrations of the few, right? For changing policy that will often come at the risk of them being disappointing the majority. And so I think when we start to reconcile these things, those are just some of the ways in which it's different when we walk into the office, which is why I made the point. If persons of color don't often unify, one voice doesn't have the same impact as a group of voices. And that becomes difficult because we're also not monolithic. And as Black people, we think differently. So it takes a little bit more energy and effort.
Yeah, you can't stereotype in any category whatsoever. But, when it comes to our kids, it's pretty clear. You have the same hopes and dreams for your kids as I do for my kids. But when it comes to this area that we all struggle, that our country struggles with, that our world struggles with, that our churches struggle with, that everybody in racial tension and cultural tension, what's your dream? What's your dream for your kids? And how do you move towards that?
Well, I think, as cliche as it sounds, I think part of it is the words of Martin Luther King Jr., which, I think I want my kids to be judged by the content of their character and not the color of their skin. And, I think the reason I raised that is because I think there will be many people who say, oh, yeah, we've heard that one before. But until it is a reality, it still is the dream. Yeah. And I think that's a big part of our conviction. The other thing is, I think part of my dream is that we would just all share in a measure of discomfort. I think, I think my immediate dream is that we would channel the realities of the Ahmaud Arbery case. And because I do believe this opportunity in recent years has allowed for the greatest opportunity for us to really lean into a conversation as people of diverse cultures, I think I just want us to lean into more cultural awareness. I think I use the language in the video. Like I want us to all kind of peek through the window of another experience and be able to just see what it's like, right? Like I want white congregants to see what it's like to be the minority as a Black person in a white church. When you love the church and you love the mission and you love the vision, but you recognize that when things are near and dear to your heart aren't represented from the platform, or you often can see your color represented, but not your culture, right? Those things happen, a lot. Or I want people to lean into the experience of what it means to say, hey, what is it that you think about when you think about your kids and their experience in the world versus my children? And I think that cultural awareness, that conversation, I want people to just ask those questions is vitally important. And I think, Pastor Shane, we'll hear that we're not as different as we think. Mm-hmm. I think my dream is that we would have a conversation and say, I want the same thing for my kids that you want for your kids. And then maybe we can use our voice differently. If two parents from the same school start to realize their different cultural perspective, it'll change what they both advocate for together at the parent-teacher conference or the PTA meeting. Because now we've had a chance to see my advocacy and your advocacy aren't that much different, but with conversation and collaboration, we can create a shared future for our children and not just one that benefits, one people group. So I think that's a dream. And I'll say this, man, last thing I would really dream for is for all of us to, I think sometimes people might think like, what do we do the next big thing we do? I think the next big thing we do is just move forward and not just move on. I think one of the challenges that I often hear, particularly from a Christian perspective, is, well, where does the place of forgiveness lie in this conversation, particularly among people of color? And I feel like here's how I would want to make sure people understand forgiveness. And while me and my wife continue to be a part of this fight and advocacy for change and bridge building in the midst of this, is I think it's important that we understand forgiveness is not just moving on. It's moving forward. That the next time this happens, that we would be further along in the conversation so that it wouldn't be shock, but it would be like, okay, we were prepared for this. I've had a measure of cultural awareness now that I don't have to start from scratch on the conversation, but there's another dialogue. So not just moving on and forgetting about it, but moving forward.
That's so good. That's so good. And I think we should mention, in case they don't watch your stories, that you were able to work with this school, work with the teacher, work with the authority, work with your daughter. She's now a homeschool, finishing her year, but so now maybe she might get some abuse at home, but people who love her. But you were able to work with the school, and I love that. That she's doing well, and we've talked about that. But these incidents haven't birthed in you the passion you have for diversity and for unity within the church, within our culture. I love that you said that, because so many of us think, I want to get to know people of color, but not necessarily embrace their culture. Well, you can't embrace someone's culture unless you're going to understand it, and then forgiveness doesn't come without conflict. So you better be ready for that. This is not an easy path. You pastor a church, a really large church in Southside. And how have you been wrestling with issues of diversity, reaching across cultures? What are you learning? But let me start you with, just tell us a little bit about where this was birthed in because it wasn't birthed in just this moment. This has been on your heart for a long time. Where was that birthed, and how did that get cultivated, the passion and vision you have for diversity?
Well, I think the conversation, of course, starts with me from my upbringing. I mentioned my grandfather, who was a white man from Tennessee, and him and my grandmother's marriage. And my grandmother already had 3 Black children at that time. Then they had 2 children together. So my mom's 2 youngest siblings are mixed. And one of my uncles married a woman from Puerto Rico, and another one married a woman from Sierra Leone, West Africa. So Thanksgiving was always confusing, and there was a lot of different, rice and this and that and stuff my aunt brought from Africa. I don't understand what's going on here. But we had a chance to see diversity up close, and everybody valued each other's culture. And I think that made an indelible imprint on me. And I didn't know the impact it was going to have in the world that I would be leading in this context. But I think that left an impression on me. And then, I guess, as mentioned, my other grandfather, who showed a resilience to, yes, I candidly, because of the experiences that he had being, abused within the law enforcement, department that he served and led in, but yet still he was resilient because he knew that he was building a better future for us. And we were the beneficiaries of his effort and his resilience. So I think so much of my heart for seeing a world of shared values when it comes to culture and color has been prompted by their courage and their leadership and their influence. And 3 of my 4 grandparents have passed away. I have the unique honor of eulogizing 2 of the 3. And each time I was able to speak about watching their courage unfold in front of my very eyes. I also mentioned, Pastor Shane, part of what I think now as I look hindsight 2020 that really helped me see it up close was that I'm a former cancer patient. So I was diagnosed with 2 tumors, 3 years of chemotherapy, 13 surgeries, told I would die 3 times. So that's where my faith and theology journey really started. But because of that experience, I was homeschooled for a couple of years through that experience, had to really go through a traumatic time of dealing with chemo and multiple surgeries. So I got a chance to just see their life and hear their stories in a way that my generation, I'm a millennial, I think up close, like, people used to sit on the stoop and listen to their grandparents' stories. I think as technology emerged through my generation, people didn't do that as much. The sitting down at the dinner table. Well, I lived with my grandparents for a little under a year at one point to get through treatment because my parents had to go back to work. And I think just their traditional values of you're going to sit here and you're going to listen and you're going to hear the stories left an indelible imprint. So they're probably a little bit longer answer than what you were looking for, but I think those things are the starting point. They were the catalyst. And then going through cancer and chemo, I think here's what I learned from that experience. Pain has a way of unifying our colors. When I was on the chemo suite and you're meeting other kids who get diagnosed with cancer, nobody cares if you're white, black, or Hispanic anymore. Every family is just like, how do we survive? How do we love on each other? I saw moms talking and crying each other's arms. And I had the unique privilege of, towards the latter part of my treatment, they asked me to be an ambassador for the hospital and talk to other patients who were recently diagnosed in their families. But they didn't only let me talk to the Black patients. They let me talk to all patients. So, I know I'm telling some stories that, again, that I didn't even share on the videos, but these experiences, while I used to wonder then, God, why me? Why am I going through all of this? And now, 20 years later, I'm saying to myself, God, I didn't realize, but that's what that experience, that medical history also unveiled for me, this reality that people are people. And it gave me a deep rooted heart for, once you go through something like that, all people want the same thing. They want a future. They want hope. They want health, and now how do I help everybody see that? So I think those experiences, again, are some of the catalysts to what I'm experiencing now. And then, if I'm being honest, Pastor Shane, my experience for a heart for diversity started outside of my theology for diversity. Some people work the other way around. It's like, well, Jesus wrote about it. It's in the Gospels. That wasn't my starting point. My starting point was cancer and seeing people's humanity beyond their color, and then my grandparents and both sets and their experience. And then from that, I was able to confirm that reality in Scripture and be like, wow, okay, no, this is theologically sound. This is what God wants. This is the heart of heaven. And so from both of those, I was able to really cultivate a heart for it. But it's not always easy, Pastor Shane. I want to acknowledge that it is not always easy. I shared in my third video, you mentioned what have been some of the difficulties I faced. And I've had, persons who visited our church who were, white families who have very candidly said, I shared one story, but there have been multiple experiences where they've said, you can preach to me, you just can't pastor me.
I like your preaching. I could never have you as a pastor. Yeah.
Yeah. You can't pastor me. And if I'm being honest, Pastor Shane, I want everybody to wrestle with this reality. If I'm being honest at my heart's level, I think some of it has been family. Some people have acknowledged, my family would, if we have children here and they are raised in a church where our children are the minority, that they wouldn't feel comfortable with that. Vice versa, I've also had people just say, I have a teenager, and I've had a couple who was a little bit older than I, and they had teenagers, and they just said, they just don't fit in here. And I'm like, I think some of it, if I'm being honest, is authentic, right? Like if your child has never experienced a place where they've been the minority, then yeah, they're going to be a fish out of water. I had an opportunity to sit on a panel, and I won't name the school because I don't think the school is at fault for this, but it was a high school and it was a Black history panel. And I was one of 4 panelists, and I remember standing there, and because I looked like a teenager, So I was standing there, and I don't think, any of the students knew that I was one of the panelists. They probably said, he looks like he goes here. And, I heard teenagers say things like, yeah, man, I didn't know it was going to be an all black panel. And this is a majority white high school, as if to say, like, I don't think I can find anything of value here. But then when asked, how many of you all have ever experienced a black teacher throughout their entire academic experience in their public school system, there was a large percentage who had never had a black teacher. And the reason I named that, Pastor Shane, is I think I want people to understand how congruent this is from church to academics to how it overlaps.
Right.
Some of these students, most of these students said, I've never had a black teacher. So elementary school, I've never had a black teacher. Middle school, I've never had a black teacher. High school, I've never had a black teacher. Or I've only had one. Which also means this. So then if they go to all white churches, and if they play on all white soccer teams with a white coach, and if they do this, that means they've never had a voice of authority in their life of color, ever, which manifests into now the first time you hear a voice of color, if it comes off as passionate, you might perceive it as aggression. Because you've never had a voice of authority of color in your life. And that's perpetuated, right? So then you hear families who say, I love your church, but I just can't put them in an environment where they're going to be uncomfortable. And I'm like, well, black people do it in white churches all the time. It really has been our culture. We've had to submit, whether it's academically or, spiritually, or so many times. So I just think, those have been some of those, just kind of, brief experiences that we've had. And yet I remain encouraged. We do have, families who are not black in our church, and couples and individuals who, are an amazing part of our community. And we try our best not to, put them on every flyer as a form of tokenism. Like, hey, can you come to the photo shoot, and
Sure.
and just
We all
value them
struggle
for who
with
they are,
that,
part of
and
our community.
striving, we're striving for diversity. We're a church that's been striving for and growing in diversity for a long time, in our city. And we have so many stories and great things, and you're going to have so many stories. I think this is a turning point in diversity in this conversation. And one of the reasons I think that is because of what you just said earlier regarding a unification around something. When you went through your cancer treatment, it did not matter what your culture or your color was.
Yep.
You shared a common pain. And right now, America shares a common pain with the tragic death of this young man, the wrongful tragic death of Ahmaud Arbery, who represents a pain that you've experienced and a discrimination you've experienced culturally, generationally, and it makes me want to learn. It makes me want to lean in. Do you see this as a turning point? And if so, how do we take advantage of that in growing our diversity and this vision that's in your heart?
Yeah, I 100% agree. I do think this is a turning point. I think this is an opportunity. I would say that I think we need to, there are probably two or three thoughts, maybe a third will emerge, but the two things that really come to mind are, one, I think this is an opportunity for us to all lean into uncomfortable conversations. And I think conversations are the catalyst and the starting point. It's not trying to understand all of Black culture, and it's not us all trying to change white culture. I think I would caution Black people listening to this, like, people give you an inch, don't take a mile, right? So it's like, here are all the historics. Just, I want to, you go, like, you can't throw the book at people. Like, there's a lot that we want to share. And if you get an ear for the first time, I think it just starts with sharing your story and sharing some of your personal experiences. And I think it's important that we all lean into some uncomfortable conversation. So that's the first thing, man. I think it's the turning point for, is that people are now open to the conversation. Let's have the conversations. And then the second thing I would say is, you hit the nail on the head, is then find common ground. Like, if it's kids, let's make a commitment as two families that our kids will grow up seeing diversity, because we'll let our kids play together once a month, right? I'm looking for opportunities to say, if our kids are mostly black and your kids are mostly white, we need to be thinking of a joint, biblical discipleship model, you know, something that we can do together, just so our kids don't grow up fearing. Because make no mistake about it, I believe in the affirmation of kids of color. Like, I think that's important, particularly, if your kids are in an environment where they're always the minority, it's important that they have an environment where their color and culture is affirmed. However, I still want my child to be a part of the solution and not a part of the problem of isolation and distance. So I think, man, finding common ground is going to be critical. And then here's the other one, Pastor Shane, it'll probably be, I think I'm developing the thought, so I might not say this as pretty and it won't be a third C. But I think I have a deep conviction for just seeing all of us find shared platforms. And here's a thought that's developing for me. And I'm even convicted by this. My wife and I were talking about this. Like there have been initiatives in our city that may have, tried to be the place where all of us come together and really lean in. And I might read the email and I might skim through it, but I haven't leaned into it. And I just think this is such an opportunity for us to say, man, there has to be something bigger than us building our own kingdoms. What can we do? And I know none of us need another thing on our plate.
Yeah.
But by golly, and I think it has to extend beyond pastors or just politicians or just community influencers. It has to trickle down into every parishioner, every person, every neighborhood. Has to say, man, there has to be something that unifies us here to say, what can we all want for our city and our culture and our communities? So again, that's a developing thought for me. But I think that the emergence of something like social media, and I'll be honest with you, Pastor, I'm not really a social media savvy. People think, like, when I released these first couple of videos, I didn't recognize the response they would get. Even though I'm a millennial, I'm not like a social media influencer.
Right.
But what I do recognize is I think we have to move the conversation from just social media to shared space. And that's what I'm wrestling with. So how do we get in shared space? So again, I don't have the answer to that yet, but that's something I think we got to do with this turning point.
When I think of racial diversity, I think from a corporate leader's perspective, right? As a church leader, I dream of the diversity growing in my own church and my own space of worship and in my own relationships. But I think relationally, I mean, Jesus thought relationally. He didn't think corporately.
Yeah.
He said, Peter, upon this rock, I'll build my church and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. He wasn't thinking through a corporate lens. He was thinking through relational lens. And I think that's where healing begins. And I wanted to just kind of end our time together and talking about, I think the Ahmaud Arbery tragedy is tragically an opportunity to talk on this specific topic of racial tension. But a part of the solution is building relationships before the crisis comes. It's kind of like what you tell your church, right? We tell our church, hey, be in relationship in small groups. So when crisis comes, you already have the lifeline built. When you're throwing the lifeline after crisis and you don't have those relationships, it's different. What does that look like for you and bringing healing in from a relational standpoint, building that prior to the crisis so that the next time, because you said the next time this happens, I hope we've moved further down the road. What does that look like? Not so much in the corporate world, but in the contextualized relationship world.
Yeah, and I'll speak personally. I guess, nothing we should proclaim or preach or promote, we shouldn't live ourselves. So, or as one professor told me in seminary, the best sermon preached is the one lived. So my wife and I really took inventory of this and said, what would we want other people to be doing and what are we doing? We started having this conversation before Ahmaud Arbery, but we have a small group that meets at our home. Well, not right now, but it was meeting at our home.
It zooms in.
Yeah. And it's made of diverse people, white, black couples, all married. Now ours is of couples who've been married for 5 years or less. Or actually, I'm sorry, 3 years or less we chose to take on. We have couples groups for other age demographics, but couples that have been married 3 years or less. And part of why we strategically did that is because we said these are the couples we believe we can sustain building the future of our church off of, some of them. But they'll also be the young families, right? That can grow up together. And so I would say, man, relationally, it looks like opening up your life to some of these relationships, pursue them. Somebody asked me a question in my Instagram account in light of me just encouraging people to lean into listening and so forth. And this girl who was from Pittsburgh, a young white girl, asked me, she said, I want to develop more community with Black friends and relationships, but I live in a neighborhood where it doesn't exist. What should be my first step? It seems awkward to just go looking for Black relationships, you know? And I told her, I said, well, I think part of it is start with the present exposure you have. It may be a coworker. It could be a classmate. Just extend an invitation to be like, hey, can we grab coffee together? Can we do lunch together? And here's the key. I think if there is no pre-existing dialogue about race already, don't feel pressure to start with race. Feel comfortable starting with life.
Yeah.
You know, what I find more often than not, Pastor Shane, is we all like talking about sports.
Yeah.
And we all like talking about our kids, and we all like talking about this and that, and finding those common grounds yield a certain measure of equity for us to dive into the deeper and more difficult topics. I'm not saying that every conversation has to go in that direction, but I think that's a great starting point. Is sometimes we don't have to always start with the difficult. When we care about everybody, we care to know about how something is impacting them. So that's a little bit what I mean by moving forward. And then I'd also say I think healing is gonna happen in a relational context when we all just kind of I think we have to be intentional about scheduling, and I hate to keep going back to this word, but scheduling the uncomfortable or scheduling the unfamiliar, right?
Yeah.
So what I mean by that is our lives are just, many of us, particularly if you have a young family or just any family, I guess, or even if you're single and you're in the professional world, our lives move at a certain pace in this day and age. And part of the reason why I think this is difficult is, right, we go to work, we work all the time. And then with the few hours that we have to ourselves, nobody is running to be in a space. We typically convene around our comforts.
That's
And
right.
I just think that, like, and if I'm being honest, Black, white, or indifferent, I get that.
Yeah.
Right? Like, we all run to the space where we have to think the least. So Black people go to a place where we can just, quote unquote, talk Black, right? And right. And no white person has ever told me this, but I'm pretty convinced that white people do the same thing, and Hispanic people do the same thing. And, you know, we all kind of run to this place where it's like, I just want to convene around my comfort. I've been at work long enough thinking about the right words and trying to be professional and trying to have emotional intelligence with my boss and my annoying coworker. I just want to spend my Saturday not thinking and just being able to say what's on my mind. I get it. And I think all cultures do that.
Sure.
But
White people do it. It just doesn't look as cool. But
but here's what I know. I know that if we really have a conviction as kingdom people to build a better future and community for all of our families and for all of our contexts, I think we're going to have to find a little bit of time in every month.
Yeah.
To say, okay, I know I could just convene around my comforts, but yes, if I invite them over and them over, yeah, I'm going to have to tell my uncle when he stops by, hey, you can't just talk the way you normally talk, and everybody kind of, and that goes for everybody, right?
Yeah.
Let me tell you something. I got some family members. If I invite you over, Pastor Shane, I might have to be like, there's going to be a talk one way or the other. Either there's going to be a talk to you to be like, hey, look, I don't know what's going to come out of my uncle's mouth. Or I'm going to have to talk to him and be like, hey, man, I got my friend Pastor Shane coming over. I'm going to need you to tone it down. And I think all of us do that.
Yeah. Maybe just don't invite them on the first get together. That's it, right?
Or don't invite them on the first. You're going to have to be very selective about who you invite. But I think those are the type of, we have to convene and curate some of those spaces so that the future can be brighter for all of our families. And that's what I'm hoping for. I'm hoping we all measure a little bit of space in our lives to lean into the conversations that matter most.
Well, I love that we're on the same page with this. And I don't love that this crisis has brought us together. But I love the results of it. And man, you said it. Let's start with life, not the crisis. Not feel the pressure of, and if you're uh, listening to this conversation, Pastor Vernon and I getting to know each other. I hope you're encouraged. I hope others watch this and go, yeah, I just need to get to know somebody. The conversation doesn't have to be, let's talk about diversity. I think we should talk about life, and I love that. Man, thank you for saying that. Thank you for sharing your perspective today. Thank you for putting yourself out there on a Facebook post. That just showed me, it showed me more who you are than what your experience was, because it showed me how vulnerable you are. And that's what made me really want to lean in and get to know you. And I don't want to do life with anyone who's not real.
Yeah.
And I'd much rather, I'll have 3 relationships with people who are real over 30 who I don't know. And so thank you for your vulnerability. Thank you for your family and just and leading this way. And I look forward to a lot more conversations together as we get to know each other.
Well, Pastor Shane, let me just say, right back at you. I think I'm appreciative. Conversations like these give me hope and encourage me to know that we're in this together as a people, as a human people. And I'm just hoping to be a part of what I believe can be a revival in our city and in our state and so many other places that it can spill out in. And let me just say, for anybody watching who might be saying, okay, that took some pressure off. I can just start off talking about life, but I am interested to know about culture and experiences and more. Just a couple resources. I mean, Pastor Shane has already alluded to it, but the Arabon content and material is a great starting point. David Bailey and the Arabon team have done an amazing job, I think, capturing what it means to navigate the conversation well. The other thing that I would say is the book, The Color of Law, is another really good one that is dense. And if you don't have a lot of attention span or like reading, maybe it's not the best starting point. But I think it paints a very practical and applicable picture. I think sometimes people of color have a frustration that they don't fully know how to, they don't have all the facts or don't know how to fully articulate in a way that meets, everybody where they are. And I think The Color of Law kind of helps everybody kind of have a light bulb moment, be like, wow, okay, this is the conversation.
Well, that's an understanding of the systems, generational after generation after generation, and how this came about. And it's an understanding that is fact too. It's not just someone's perspective. It's actually events that happened, systems that were created. That's a great suggestion.
Yeah, so I think those two things. And then the last thing I would just really quickly say as a practical example, I was thinking about that, Shane. Again, I really didn't imagine how quickly the videos would spread. Again, I was just sharing my heart. But one of the things this forced me to do over the weekend and time of prayer and reflection is, what are some ways, and I'm actually working now on some personal initiatives that I'll be sure to keep you up to date with. And I just think, that would be another part of us furthering these conversations. But one of the things I thought about was another great example is like dinner and a movie. And I'll tell you, like, there are a couple movies now, again, that you don't have to watch these movies. Don't consider them like pastoral plea or only thing you can watch. But some of my greatest conversations with friends who don't look like me have been across looking at a movie that raises awareness about a social issue in a non-threatening way, but open the door for a curated conversation. Couple that come to mind are a movie like Us. I don't know if anybody's seen this movie, but it's like, it's promoted as a horror movie, but it's really not that scary. But there are so many cultural motifs that we were able to talk about, like, oh, that's what a person of color sees when they see this. Well, oh, that's how I perceive that.
Right.
And what conversation that's created. Like, you have, the tension in that movie between HBCUs and predominantly white institutions. You have the conversation between what it means to try to be a Black couple trying to make it and afford advancement of opportunity versus, when you just are inherently a part of that community. So many wonderful conversations can emerge from the arts. And so I think sometimes that can be a more non-threatening way. So maybe you're saying, hey, I got a friend of color, or two families are going to get together. Where can we start? We just don't want to sit around a fire and be like, hey, let's talk about race. You know what I'm saying? So, where do we start? So I just think that's another practical way. I mean, if you have some existing relationships and you can just dive in head first, go by all means do so. But maybe a movie or two, maybe movies like that, The Hate You Give, other contexts like that will create some dialogue as well.
That's great. And we'll just have some watch parties together.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, man, thank you, Pastor. Thank you for ministering to us today. And thanks for getting to know me, letting me get to know you a little bit. I'm looking forward to many more of these conversations, my friend.
Well, I'm very grateful, Pastor Shane. Thank you so much. And I'm doing a whole series on this in June. So don't be surprised if I try to get you on an interview. I have to get you to reciprocate this.
I would love that. I would love that, man. We definitely need to share some ministry together. It's an honor to minister to our city together. And we're in this together for sure. So we just want the same thing. His kingdom come, his will be done right here in Richmond, Virginia, as it is in heaven. So, hey, man, I'm getting to know you and already growing to love you. So thank you for taking this time.
Man, thank you so much, Pastor Shane. I appreciate you, and I hope you're still watching The Last Dance. I heard you know a little bit about that, so we'll have to.
Hey, let's have that watch party, man.
Yeah, for sure.
That's important. Some sports television. We don't have any live television, so my boy, I have 3 boys, so yeah, The Last Dance is pretty important.
For sure, man. We'll make it happen.
All right, man. Thank you, my friend.